So we're talking about Red Herring, which is a new documentary out in cinemas now. We're a little bit late with this one. My name is Phil, and I'm joined by Chris, who's there in the next box. He's not in the same room, as you can see. He's far away. So this is obviously a documentary. This is from a filmmaker called Kit Vincent, who is a very young filmmaker. I think 24 in the documentary. It's really hard to say because I don't know when this was filmed. I'm guessing maybe last year or maybe the year before. I know that he's doing the rounds with festivals. A very difficult subject to discuss because obviously it's a very personal and sensitive subject to talk about, particularly for that family, because it's all about his terminal diagnosis and how his family are reacting to it. And you see them doing things that they wouldn't normally do, which is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that you and I were quite interested in about this film, I think, was the nature of it as a documentary. You know, it's got to be honest, it's got to be showing real people dealing with real things, and what they're dealing with here is something really difficult. And, you know, Kit says at the very beginning in the narration that he wanted to make a film about how his family deal with his diagnosis more than about his view of his diagnosis. But for me, it becomes very much about the family and about their dynamics and about them as people, way much more than it's about him and his diagnosis. And I think that's a quite an interesting, challenging thing about this documentary. Normally you would sit down to watch something like this expecting to hear the story of someone's health through their diagnosis and how they deal with it and blah, blah, blah. And it's actually quite interesting to take the focus externally to that person. But I think that certainly a struggle I had with it as a consequence of that then is that it seems like Kit and his diagnosis and his condition are not really the subject of this film, because it's actually about his family and the fact that he has divorced parents and you know, they deal with it in their own individual ways. You spend a lot of time, I certainly spent a lot of time watching this film thinking about the relationship between these three people, and actually also then Kit's girlfriend as well, the relationships between these people much, much more than his diagnosis. And a sort of guilt happens, doesn't it, where you realise that you're consumed by this sort of real life drama of all these people's lives, and you sort of think, oh, but I'm not feeling anything about Kit's diagnosis or his condition. But that's because it's not really the subject of the film. But you still feel a bit awkward about that, don't you?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you are a fly on the wall. So you're watching all this playing out, and you're being a voyeur. And it's at times I think it's uncomfortable because you're seeing a lot of suffering. You're seeing his dad suffering. I mean, they're all suffering in different ways, but I think his dad is more visibly suffering on this documentary, and he doesn't like his son's pain and the anguish that he's going through. And it's interesting what you said about this documentary being about them. I guess ultimately it is about him because it's the effect that his terminal diagnosis is having on the family. So it comes back to him, but it's not obviously about him because you're seeing these reactions from different members of his family. But I mean, his girlfriend, I think, is probably the most closed, and not in a negative way, but she just doesn't want to maybe express as much as the other members of the family do, which I thought was really interesting because they're all different.
She's quite boundaried, I think, and is very conscious of the camera, and is very sort of that there's just some stuff I don't want to talk about on camera, and why have you got that camera in my face and stuff, which interestingly neither of his parents ever seem to do in the film. They're very happy or comfortable with the camera being there. There's quite an interesting moment where Kit and his father change places. He starts to interview his father, and it actually turns up being an interview. You know, the father's asking the questions. Actually, that's quite kind of interesting. But I do think as a documentary it's very interesting because it ostensibly is about Kit and his diagnosis and his illness, but it actually kind of isn't. That is a part of the film, but it's not and you might say it's the central thing of the film, but actually for me the central thing of the film was really how other people have dealt with it. And it was kind of interesting to witness people dealing with this kind of news and let's be honest, being a bit selfish about it sometimes and thinking about themselves, or, you know, you being able to sort of see how they react in a way that you kind of think, oh, okay, well, that may not be the ideal way of reacting to that news. I mean, it's hard for me to say. I've not been in that situation. But, you know, it's interesting to see a sort of different take on it. The Walt Disney version of these kind of films is obviously, you know, person gets diagnosis, person's family all crowd around and are really supportive, and it's all very upsetting and caring. And this film is not like that. That is not their family dynamic, and that is not how they take the news. That is not how they deal with it. And that's interesting. That's an interesting take on a sort of diagnosis film.
So Kit's intention was to leave a piece of work that his family can look at and be uplifted by, which I found honourable. I really love that idea, is that he was being selfless because he wanted them to remember him in good ways. I don't think we really got a lot of that, though, because I think a lot of the film was about the family's suffering. I mean, it wasn't them in tears all the time, and it wasn't, like you said, depressing, because there were moments of the film. I mean, it's beautifully shot, for one thing, because they're living on the south coast. I think it's Bournemouth or near Bournemouth, and you see a lot of the coast, and it's gorgeous, and it's very bright. It's very, I'm guessing it was shot in summer, so it does feel bright as a film to watch, but there is a lot of suffering in there. I guess there's a lot of soul searching as well, because you see Kit's father converting to Judaism as well. So, there is a lot of optimism there as well, because I guess they're learning, aren't they? And they're learning how to cope with life in a different way and experience life differently.
I think this theme that Kit sets up at the beginning about it being this memento he's leaving behind, this kind of this memory of him, is a really interesting thing. Any artist, anybody who makes anything, is putting something out into the world which will be there a lot longer sometimes than they will. And I think Kit's very aware of that. He's very kind of, look, I'm not going to last forever, but this film may well be able to last for me. But it's a curious memory to leave behind. It's a curious memento to leave behind, because in my view, it's slightly a memento. It's a picture of a family dealing with some really, really difficult news to deal with. And as I say, they don't necessarily deal with it in always a particularly predictable way, or a particularly positive way, even sometimes. And sometimes they're not really dealing with it. So it's a curious thing to have left behind. I'm sure the intent was to leave behind, as you say, a sort of, a set of memories. This is a curious set of memories, because it's not leaving a time capsule behind in this condition might be like, oh, here's me on my 5th birthday, here's me on my bike, here's me going to school for the first time. And it's just not like that at all. It isn't that kind of memento at all. It's a memento of a moment in time where they're dealing with something really difficult. And I'm not sure it's a memento you'd ever want to look back at for that reason, to be honest.
No, I was just going to say that, because I guess it's more a memento of what they've learned, which is a good thing, because that's a positive thing, because they're obviously enriching their lives more because of experiences that they've not had before. So they're learning about other things, which I think is a very positive, forward-looking thing, isn't it? So it's admirable in that respect, I think. But it's not necessarily the traditional kind of photo album of his life, of Kit's life. So it's different, and it's original in that respect. And wow, what a great kind of thing to leave behind, I guess, as a young filmmaker, because this is a really kind of solid piece of work when you're looking at how films are made. I thought it was really professional. I mean, to look at it, in some ways it seems really polished for a documentary that's touching on, his brain tumour. It's not necessarily fly on the wall video camera. This is proper gear that he's using, and it does look very cinematic. So in some ways that doesn't feel kind of, I was going to say authentic. That's not the right word, because it is authentic, because it's obviously a life story, but it feels more cinematic than, say, someone that's picked up a video camera and is just shooting randomly.
Absolutely, and I think what we're agreeing on here is that this is a novel documentary. It's not a documentary that you might see on Netflix about somebody else's diagnosis or whatever. This is not just another diagnosis or illness film. It's not even just another film about family dynamics. It's quite different in lots of ways, whether that's about the way it's shot, or whether that's about the way the characters are interacting with each other, or even the intent of the film. All of those things do challenge our preconceptions about documentaries, and I think that's got to be a good thing. And that level of maturity from a first-time filmmaker, I assume his first time, certainly in his mid-20s, is really, to be applauded. To leave behind a memento that does that in itself, even if it doesn't really leave a sign behind it to the family or the diagnosis or whatever. His legacy will be that he made a different sort of documentary, I think.
Yeah, I don't know much about him, actually. I'm going to do a bit of research on him, because I'm guessing he's got a filmmaking background. Maybe he studied it at college or uni. There's a lot to celebrate. There is a lot of credit there for this. I don't know whether it's something I really enjoyed. I think it's something I am thinking about, because I think it was very brave of him to do this, and an original idea, and also, creative with it. And on top of everything else, this is a guy who's gone through such a traumatic time, and finding out, like you say, at a very early age. I think it's very mature of him to do all this, I think. So, but I just don't know whether it's something that I necessarily enjoyed. I can see the credit, because there's a lot to applaud.
It's always difficult to say you've enjoyed something that's ostensibly, not a happy experience, isn't it? It's not. I don't think it was a particularly uplifting film. I also don't think it was a particularly depressing film. I think there was an honesty about it that's sort of quite neutral in that regard. It's not sentimental. It's not kind of cloying. There's not people crying all the time. I mean, there are tears in it, but it's not. It's not like. It hasn't got, massive string-laden kind of soundtrack that's kind of really inducing us to kind of cry along with it at all. It's not that kind of film. But, it's sort of, it tries to play a fairly neutral hand emotionally, which is quite an interesting thing to try and do in a situation like that. And again, I think that's one of its great strengths, is that it doesn't break some molds for a documentary, for sure. Whether you enjoy it or not, and whether you'd want to sit and watch it again, are sort of slightly academic questions in a way, because I don't think these kind of films you can even apply those things to, really.
Yeah, because I think if it wasn't for the public, he could have made this film for them as a very personal thing. But obviously he's put it out there, which I guess is, a conversation starter as well, which is an excellent thing, because, other people are going through this as well, and they might learn something from this as well, because I think it does teach you about soul searching and about embracing new experiences. So I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a great illustration of how one particular family deal with one particular person's particular diagnosis. And it's important for us, I think, as an audience, to remember that not all diagnoses are the same, not all illnesses are the same, not all families are the same, and not all patients are the same, not all central characters are the same. And it's a really good reminder of that, because, as I say, there is a bit of an identikit way to do documentaries and even dramas that deal with issues like this, and this one is not those things. So it's a great reminder that circumstances are individual and things are different. And as I say, I think for me those will be the kind of legacy parts of this as a project, probably slightly more than it's a picture of his family. It's a bigger thing than that for me. It's really nice to review a documentary amongst some of the other stuff we do. We particularly like, scary films and dramatic films and all that kind of stuff, and it's really interesting to watch a documentary amongst all of this. It's actually really interesting to watch a different take on, again, another genre that we're all familiar with. So that's been really interesting.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and check out our other video, which is above us, floating above our heads, as they always are. Well, they don't kind of float. They're static. They just sit there. But they're ready to be clicked on.